So there you go. Good morning, everybody. My name is John Latta. I am the lead pastor here, and for those of you that might have come like a really, really long way expecting to see and hear a Brexy teaching, this is as good as you're going to get. I've got a beard. I probably weigh about 30 pounds less, but other than that, Brooks is a great friend. This is actually a really, really fun day because if you are not familiar with the way the Meeting House does church, is that we have 18 different locations across Ontario in which a lead pastor, that is the person responsible for each one of those sites or congregations, is actually doing some teaching today. Now, when I was hired, I actually didn't hire to teach, I hired to lead. So that's a whole other question. So you're going to get somebody who doesn't teach that often, but on the other hand, when I have the opportunity, I can't tell you how much of a privilege it is to do this. Before I start, is that I want to say this. Thank you so much, Corrine. Thank you so much, Karen, for taking the responsibility to keep in front of us this amazing opportunity for us to work with others that are in need in other countries. We are so privileged in Canada, and the Talley family are a great representation of what we can do when we get together and we support and help other people. And so I only say that because please take that card home and consider giving and consider doing your best to contribute. But I want you to really work hard to pray and to pray for the El Delati family. And some of the ways that we can help support them as moving forward is very, very, very important that we do that. So let's jump into today's teaching, and that is, as you were reading, maybe you followed that or not, but we are heading into John chapter 7, and today we're going to look at verses 1 to 24. Now, we're going to be looking at John chapter 7 today, and we're going to look at it next week, and we're also going to look at it a third week. So it is actually a fairly lengthy passage. I think next week is really the kind of like the point of the whole chapter. So today what we're going to do is hopefully I will do my best to prepare us and prepare you for what it is that, for what some teaching is. And I think there's a nugget or two that we can get out of this. So where are we at in the story? If you were following us a year ago, we actually did John chapter 6. In John chapter 6, remember the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000? Remember that story? If those of us who've grown up in church backgrounds, that was part of that reading. But the context in which we're looking at this story today is that right after that, Jesus did some teaching that really ticked a bunch of people off. And a bunch of people that were followers or disciples, not the 12, but others who were following him, they actually left him. And that would be in John chapter 6 and verse 66. So we're going to pick up this story now, and it is about 6 months later. And this is where you read, after this, Jesus went around to Galilee. He did not want to go about in Judah because the Jewish leaders were there looking for a way to kill him. So we are now at the story and we're going, what in the world is going on? Now, if you read kind of quickly the story, here's a nutshell version of what we got happening. So if you want to know what's going on in John chapter 7, verse 1 to 24, it says this. So Jesus had a bunch of disciples leave him. That was in John 6, 66. He is now in Galilee, and so if you think about it, it's more the countryside, and he's purposely avoiding Judea where there are threats against his life. His brothers challenge him to go public with his ministry at the Festival of Tabernacles. We see their actual motives because they don't believe him. Jesus tells them he's not going to go, but his brothers actually go. Then Jesus goes, but he does it in secret. Then at the festival, Jewish leaders were already looking for him. The crowds are talking about him. Some were with him, some were against him. And then because of these religious leaders, these people were afraid to talk openly about Jesus. Then Jesus goes into the temple in the middle of the festival and he actually starts teaching. And he challenges the crowd that his teaching comes from God, but theirs comes from themselves. And then he says, so he challenges how people judge and how to use their judgment. Okay, there's like a lot of stuff in this passage. So let's try and slow it down a little bit. I want to break it down to the first few verses in from verse 2, and it says this. Where do we go here? For the sake of time, you guys see it up there. Verse 5 says, "For even his brothers did not believe him." Did you know that Jesus had brothers? Did you? How many brothers do you think Jesus had? actually, we know he had 4, but some people think he had 5, maybe even 6. Kind of weird, right? That we don't have like an actual understanding what that is. And then he also has 2 sisters. Now, one of the things we do know, that even though the brothers didn't believe him now, that we do know that one of his brothers, James, actually kind of caught fire and went on to be one of the leaders of the church. And James actually wrote his own book in the Bible. So we know, though, that things do turn out differently than they are today. And one of the things I find interesting is, especially in this passage, is that what happens is that at this point, they did not follow, his own brothers did not follow him and see him as the Messiah. And they challenged him to say, this festival is coming, Jesus. Come on down to this festival. Come with us. And then there's going to be this massive crowd of people, and you can prove yourself. Now, we're not quite sure their motives, but most of some of the readers I was reading said probably the motives weren't one of being that good. They wanted to figure out and say, let's stop all this nonsense. Let's just get you to be my brother again, because there's something happening here. And so I was thinking about this and thinking, okay, what would it be like to be one of Jesus' brothers in that time? And then I realized, I don't have any brothers. Did you guys know that about me? Sorry, I say that because some people said, John, tell me something personal about you. I'm an only child. I'm it. This is it. So basically, some of you, how many of you are only children in this room? Children? How many of you? Anybody? Okay, 1 or 2 in here? What's that? The deal of it is that I cannot even fathom life, and I'm just realizing this, because sometimes you think I can relate with you. I have never had a sibling, ever. But then I got married. Did you guys know how many siblings my wife has? My wife has 9. And so what happens along the way is that for now, Christy, her life is through a lens of many siblings. So there's lots of sharing happening. By the way, I thought I was a really good sharer. But then I realized, I only share with myself. But now you're looking at her life, the lens she's looking at, and then she sees life through many siblings. Now, I won't get into what, when we first got married, by the way, I loved it. It was instant family. But I also realized, it's pretty quick, is that as you get into instant families, you don't agree on everything at all. And some, by the way, I love my in-laws, and I love this family that I'm part of. Christy, there you go, just want to make sure. But we do not necessarily make the same choices. And there are times when I'm like, what are they doing? Or they might say, I'm sure, on the other end, John, you're nuts. So part of that is that as I think through the lens of what's happening in this story, it's very hard for me to put myself in the perspective of this, but I do recognize that when we're talking about even the closest relationships with us, people just don't always get us. And so Jesus found himself in this place where he was, even with his own brothers, finding that they just did not understand him. Let's just skip ahead a little bit, because I think this is an important part of the story. In John chapter 7, and now we're going to read from verse 10. And I want to read this. It says, however, after his brothers had left for the festival, so he says, by the way, in the earlier verses, the brothers say, Jesus, come to the festival with us. And Jesus said, no, I'm not going to the festival with you. It's not my time. Now what happens is we hit verse 10, and it says, after the brothers had left for the festival, he went also, not publicly, but in secret. What? I don't know, I read this like 3 times. Like, Jesus, what? You said you weren't going, but now you go. And I think what's interesting about this is that it was more this idea of the timing, is that Jesus was saying, I am not ready to go yet. I am not ready to go yet. There was this idea of timing. And we're going to get to that in a second, but I want to lean in a little bit to this idea of these festivals. I found this kind of interesting. Like, what is this festival that is happening at this time that would be so important to go to? Well, if you follow the Jewish tradition at all, they have tons of holidays, okay? There's a lot. If you've ever worked with somebody from a Jewish background, it feels like, are you working or actually on holiday most of the time? And I'm not joking, because I felt like that when I was in school with people. It's like that have a Jewish background. It's like, oh, you have another vacation day. So part of it here, though, is that this is very, very important that there's actually, as we hone in these three, they're called pilgrimage festivals, and they are the Passover, Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, and then the Feast of Tabernacles. Do not have time to dig into this too deeply, but Bruxy actually did a teaching specifically on the Passover feast, and he did that in week 6 of The Death and Life of God, Losing My Religion. So if you want to go back and look at that, he did an amazing job on that. But what this festival is that, by the way, in John chapter 6, this is in your notes, John chapter 6, that was the Passover. And then we're looking at John chapter 7, and now we're at the Feast of Tabernacles. And then if you want to jump forward, John chapter 13, we're not there today, but if you look at John chapter 13, you're back at the Passover again. So you're looking from John chapter 6 to John chapter 13 is 1 year. We're looking at about a 6-month period of time right now. Now here's what we really need to know, and those of us who are more familiar with Jesus' story, is that in John chapter 13 is when they actually start taking the initiative to kill Jesus. So we're in this last year of Jesus' ministry, and this is the context that we see ourselves in. So this whole idea of the the pilgrimage, they're on this pilgrimage, and then they come to this tabernacle of feasts. It's the tabernacle, the Feast of the Tabernacles. And so this is also called the Feast of the Feast of Booths, Booths, or tents. And what this is it's a representation of the 40-year journey of the people that were coming out of Egypt. And this whole wandering journey where they were given protection from God, and they were given nourishment of food from God. And so all of the Jewish people would come into Jerusalem, and they would come for this period of time, and they would celebrate, and they wouldn't go get hotel rooms. They set up tents. They set up booths. They set up these small places. And this is this idea of this celebration of understanding that God is with us now because God was with us during that journey. You're looking at a time when all the Jewish people from the countryside, from all these other small towns, would come and gather together in this one location in Jerusalem. It was like, I'll say, party central in its own way. It was the place where everybody came. It was also the place where the Jewish leaders would come, and especially many of the people who would be called rabbis, they would be the ones that would share the message of God and their own interpretations of what that message was. So you're talking about a lot of people here from different backgrounds. And so this is what Jesus says originally, it's not time to go, but then actually Jesus does go at the right time, but he doesn't make fanfare of it. He comes, and he comes in secret. Then we hit verse 14, and I want to read this to you. So not until halfway through the festival did Jesus go up to the temple courts to begin to teach. The Jews there were amazed and asked, "How did this man get such learning without having been taught?" Jesus answered, "My teaching is not my own. It comes from the one who sent me. Anyone who chooses to do the will of God, and will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whatever I speak on my own." Verse 18, "Whoever speaks on their own does so to gain personal glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me? You are demon-possessed." And the crowd answered, "Who is trying to kill you?" We're finding ourselves in a place now where the right time had come. And now Jesus decides to move forward right into the center. And as Jesus starts to teach, right from the beginning of what Jesus says, there's already opposition within the leaders of the religious community that were at stake. Rabbis follow rabbis. Jesus follows God. And that really bothered those religious leaders. And so what we're seeing here is that they had already been wanting the religious leaders already had said, we want to kill Jesus. But now what's happening is Jesus is actually saying, look, this is the message that I am moving forward. Here is the clear announcement of the gospel, that you are not understood, that this message is from God, it's not from anybody else. And this became the focal point of what the religious leaders were most annoyed with about Jesus. This idea of authority, who gives you the authority to say what you say? This probably was at the end of the day what the brothers had the most problem with too. Is that, Jesus, you're one of our brothers, but you're saying God gives you authority. Our authority comes from the rabbis, the other religious leaders that teach us. So if you can imagine, and I don't know, I was thinking about that. I was thinking sort of things through, saying, at the meeting house, if you've been following us, we don't call our teacher, Bruxy, the rabbi, but I have heard many of us, especially in home church settings or other ones, saying, you know, what authority do you say that? And then people say, well, Bruxy says it. And I think we all need to be very, very careful. By the way, I love Brux, and I think that the teaching, we really try and be as accountable as possible. But at the end of the day, God is the one who gives us this authority. And therefore, we all need to understand that God is who gives us the authority so that we can live our lives and be obedient to what God would say to us. Our rabbi, our teacher, our helper helps us understand what God's teaching says. And so all of us, I think, can become kind of religious and kind of be a little bit, I think we can be controlling in this area if we're really not careful. And then that leads us to the last area, the last part of this passage. In verse 21, Jesus said to them, I did one miracle, and you are all amazed. Yet because Moses gave you circumcision, though actually it didn't come from Moses, but from the patriarchs, you circumcise a boy on the Sabbath. Now, if a boy can be circumcised on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you so angry with me for healing a whole man's body on the Sabbath? Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. Boy, it's so nice to be able to talk about circumcision when you're teaching on the one day. So, two things. Number one is that I do one miracle. Jesus actually is speaking about, if you go back to John chapter 5, where there's a man and he's down by a pool of water, and he can't get he can't get into this pool. And Jesus basically says, come up, stand up, and you are healed. And what's happening is that encounter with this man being healed happened on the Sabbath. It happened on a day when the religious leaders of the community were like, no, nothing can be done. So by Jesus actually healing somebody on this day, the Sabbath, that became another irritant in the religious community. And that became something that they were working against him. But what Jesus is saying is, but hold on a second here. How come you can circumcise on the Sabbath? Does anybody kind of know a bit of the religious background about circumcision? By the way, there is a website, 20 things you need to know about circumcision if you want to go. Check on it later, it's kind of interesting. Is that in the religious tradition, they actually would circumcise on the 8th day. Now the reason for that in terms of the religious tradition is there would at least be one Sabbath that would be allowed to have passed. So this whole idea of 7 days, one day being a Sabbath, the 8th day, whatever that would be. But from time to time, just like any calendar, certain things happen on certain days, and then the 8th day would actually land on the Sabbath. And for some reason, what they would do is they would actually say, well, that's okay, that one doesn't count. And so what Jesus is basically saying is that you already are saying something doesn't count. And it has actually to do, I don't know if you know this or not, but the Sabbath has to do with healing. The circumcision actually has to do with healing. And what did Jesus do in John chapter 5? He healed somebody. And so he was just holding them to a mirror of saying, what you're saying, actually, you are judging incorrectly. And so when we put a lot of this whole package together and we look at what we actually look at this passage, I want to end, but before we end, I actually want to end on this last verse. But I'd like you to see a video that we were at Christy and I were at a banquet last week, and this video was shown. And I'm still not sure if we have permission for it or not, but that's okay. We'll show it to you. If not, I'm sorry. But the lens by which we look about judging, I really want you to see this video. And let's watch it, and then I'll have some closing thoughts. Do you guys see that before? Yeah. It's going viral. It's one of those things, when I was reading this passage, I was like, Jesus, even in the midst of this story, and again, this is part 1, part 2 next week, I think is the real core teaching, but he shares with us this nugget of judging. Isn't it true? And I love the way that the New Living Translation says it. It says, stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. Look beneath the surface so that you can judge correctly. When we're following Jesus, when we truly call ourselves Christ followers, sometimes we don't represent him well, just because of the way we judge other people. We have to be people that look beneath the surface. And doesn't say don't judge, but judge correctly. I don't know, Cody, I think at first glance, was somebody who probably the majority of people that encounter him wouldn't expect what they got. And when I first saw that clip, I'm like, what? That is unbelievable. And that's just a representation of what we and how we should live life on a daily basis as a Jesus follower. I put some notes in on your takeout, and it just says this. The brothers were on the surface, they were judging on the surface because they were more concerned in this story about the timing of Jesus going to the festival. The crowds were on the surface, they were concerned with the credentials that Jesus had. And then the Jewish on the surface, they were concerned with just keeping the law. And so, as we reflect on being Jesus followers, how does Jesus affect us so that we can be a catalyst affecting others for him? I pray you come back or listen to the teaching. I know we're into summer, because I think the next 3 weeks are going to be a really, really, really good way to, again, look more into the book of John, chapter 7. Let's pray, and then I have a few announcements. Father, thank you for bringing us here today. And Father, I thank you for this wonderful day, especially as we get to reconnect with the Talley family and just to see how well they are doing. Father, we are so grateful for this family and just for the way that they have been a part of our lives and our church community. We also pray, though, Lord, that you will help us sponsor Wells to get behind and to uphold this El Delati family with their finances, through some of the things that they need within their home, but also just praying for them and supporting them with whatever their needs would be. And so, Father, we believe you're out there ahead of us, and we just need to follow you as far as working well with this family. And Father, for whatever the teaching was today, we recognize that Jesus had so many obstacles and such opposition, but yet his timing, his clarity of message was always to make sure that people understood that his authority only came from you. And so, Father, we just pray that we will also align ourselves with you. Father, may our hearts be open to how you would teach us. In your name, amen.